Welcome back. We are on Chapter 9, which is going to cover cognitive development in the early childhood years, ages 2 to 6. Okay, let's get started. So, as you recall from infancy, Piaget thought that babies were in the sensory motor stage. And I made a real point to mention in that lecture that he thought that babies exited the sensory motor stage once they started to display symbolic representation of the world. Another way of saying that is they start to talk. They start to use words to represent objects out in the world, thoughts inside their heads, memories, things like that. So once they can start to use those kinds of symbols to represent reality or fantasy or other things, they have entered the pre-operational stage of cognitive development, according to Piaget. Hallmarks of the pre-operational stage, they start to have mental representations of the world, which is what we call memory. They can store in their heads their own representation of what has happened or what they have seen or these kinds of things. And that's the beginning of memory. They show evidence that they can learn from their actions. They can be told, no, that's wrong if they take a cookie when they weren't supposed to, and they can learn from that and they change their behavior in the future. They also can learn from their own reflections on what happened. So they can, without any feedback from an adult or anybody else, they can, let's say, touch something that's hot and say to themselves, my fingers started to hurt while I was touching that. Maybe I won't touch that anymore. Now, I'm not exactly sure that that's the thought that they're having, but I'm saying that they can make their own reflection and not necessarily need the environment to tell them that's too hot or that's too high or things like that. They can reflect on it themselves now. All right, so keeping that in mind, some big cognitive changes that they display. Something that we call, or Piaget coined the phrase identity to mean that they recognize that the individual's identity doesn't change even though they may look different. I found this poor cat on the internet. I don't know whose human thought this was fun to put their poor cat in a costume, but anyway, I've never had a cat that would have put on a costume, so maybe I've had the wrong cats. Anyway, so they've got this cat in a costume that looks like the dinosaur is eating the cat, right? A 2 to 6-year-old child realizes that has not suddenly become some kind of cat dinosaur hybrid and that the cat is now a different creature. It recognizes that this is a cat wearing a costume. This is a really big, important cognitive change because this is going to help fuel children to be able to pretend that they can wrap a sheet over their shoulders and now they have a superhero cape on or something like that. This year when my granddaughter was 3.5 and my grandson was 1.5, my mom and I spent all of December making a dress-up box for the two of them because they're both sort of, he's at that burgeoning age where soon he's going to be able to pretend like he's, a fireman, or he can pretend like he's a cowboy or something. Interestingly, he seems to prefer her dresses a lot. We made little apron style dresses where all she has to do is put it around her neck and then mommy ties the back. And now from the front, it looks like she's wearing a dress. And that's why it's really important. I wanted to bring this example up is that it doesn't have to be a really convincing costume that they put on. It's all about their imagination developing. And so if it kind of sort of looks like she's wearing a party dress, then she can more adamantly say, I'm going to a party, or I'm the princess, or I'm a fairy, or whatever she or he want to pretend like they are, right? It fuels their fantasy. And so they realize that they haven't really become a fairy, they haven't really become a firefighter, but that they're still them, but they're pretending. And that's the beauty. When you realize that you are stably you and that you can pretend other things, that opens up a whole bunch of play topics and imaginary things that you can do that are going to help a person in the ultimate development of what they like, what they don't like, all these things that become their identity in the long run. So recognizing that they are consistently stable is the first step in that. And that the things around them are stable. Remember, we talked about object permanence when we talked about infancy. Well, you need object permanence before you can get identity permanence. There's also function permanence, where certain objects have certain functions. And so children realize that if I can use a spoon to scoop Cheerios out of milk for breakfast, I could probably use a spoon to scoop sand out of the sandbox, right? Like it's the same basic kind of function. And they start to be able to realize that, functions are consistent. They are really interested in how things function. So sometimes they'll take things apart that they shouldn't have taken apart. A lot of times they show a lot of interest in the very objects that their parents do not want them touching, like, for example, electronic devices that aren't for them. They really like their parents' phones. They really like the remote control for the TV. I saw a reel on Instagram where they put a toy remote next to the infant and they put the real remote next to the infant, and the infant wants the real one. Even though the toy one is all sorts of colors, and if you push the buttons, lights will come on. From, early infancy really on, children recognize that this is the stuff that adults use. These are the things that really do something in the world. These are toys, they're fun, I kind of like them, but these really do something in the world. And my job as a child is to figure out how things function so that one day I can be a grown-up who knows how to do things in the world also. So play is really kind of children's work. It's their job to figure out how the world works, and things like that. And so focusing in on the function of objects is a really important milestone for these pre-operational children. They want to know how things work. Now, pre-operational children are personally, for me, the most fun stage because they make such awesome thinking errors. Here's an example of a Piagetian task. So let's imagine that the child depicted is between 2 and 6 years of age. They're probably, let's be honest, between 4 and 6 because it's really hard to test younger children because their verbal skills are just so inadequate to explain their reasoning. So probably the child depicted is somewhere between 4 and 6 years of age. Now in the top left picture, the child is shown 2 beakers of water or 2 glasses of water that are very carefully exactly the same amount of water so that the child will agree the 2 containers have the same amount of water. Now in the upper right picture, you see the adult says, okay, now watch me while I pour the water from this container into that container. And they pour the water from the original short fat container into this new tall skinny one. And then they say at the bottom, in that last panel, they say to the child, okay, does this one have more water? Well, pointing to the tall one. Does this one have more water? When pointing to the short one. Or do they both have the same amount? Typically, children will focus on one dimension of the object. So in this case, she's pointing at the tall skinny one because she's focusing on height. Sometimes children will focus on width. In my experience of all the children I've tested, they tend to focus on the height. I personally have never tested a child who picked the short fat one. They don't always pick the one that just recently changed either. If you start with tall skinny ones and you pour a tall skinny into a short fat, they'll still typically pick the tall skinny. It's not just about which one changed. They'll pick the one that looks to them like it has more because they're focusing on one dimension, in this case height. If they pick the short fat one, that would indicate they were focusing on width, right? Because they would recognize that it was a wider amount of water. You as an adult, given panel 2, that upper right hand one, watching the water pour from the beaker into the tall skinny beaker, you would recognize that no water was added or subtracted. So no matter how it might look now, it has to be the same amount of water because where else would it have gone or where else did it come from? So it has to be the same amount. But children during the pre-operational stage don't think like that. They don't really focus on the transformation. And even though you draw their attention and you say, watch me while I pour this, they don't really process the pouring and the fact that all the water from the short fat glass went into the beaker and there was none left in the short fat glass. There was none added from anywhere else. They don't notice those things. All they focus on is the end states. How does it look in the end? And if one looks taller in the end, they'll fixate on that. If one looks wider in the end, they'll fixate on that. And that's it. So these typical thinking errors are a result of what we call centration. Piaget coined this term. He spoke German, and so sometimes I wonder if the translations were not perfect. Centration refers to that tendency to focus on one dimension, one aspect. So in this case, the height of the water. In other circumstances, other kinds of tests, you might have a child that focuses on the amount of table that's covered by the object, or they might focus on the whether one object is sticking out past the edge or not. They'll be focusing on some aspect and not compensating for it on the other end, with the other dimensions. So they make these mistakes. They demonstrate another thinking error called irreversibility. In the case of this water pouring, like I said, you as an adult, you watched it pour, so you're going to know that it's the same amount of water no matter how it looks. But you also have this backup ability to say, well, if I were to pour it out of the tall, skinny one back into the short, fat one, we'd be exactly back where we were. So yeah, it's got to be the same amount. But for a child, a pre-operational child, they can't mentally reverse objects. So they display what we call irreversibility, where once it's now in this state, we can't imagine putting it back in its original state. So for example, if a child has a string of beads and the string breaks and all the beads go all over the floor, they may literally think that there are now more beads because they're all over the place and it looks like more to them. They can't imagine just stringing them all back onto the string and seeing that there's the same amount. Even more frustrating as an adult parent, grandparent or aunt or uncle or something, is that the child may now be just bereft. They're like, it's broken, it's ruined, now it's just a bunch of beads. It can never be a necklace again. And you're like, this is just a bunch of beads on a string. I can put them back for you. But no, it's ruined. If you make the mistake of, let's say, cutting their sandwich into 4 pieces instead of just 2 pieces, oh no, it's ruined. It's changed fundamentally, and I can't imagine that it could ever just be 2 pieces. Of course, once you eat it, it's all ruined anyway. Kid, just eat it. But they don't get that logic. They don't understand it. They have no concept of, I could just reverse it back to how it started, or let's think about where it's going anyway. Who cares what the sandwich looks like? They can't. They just can't visualize that sort of thing. They focus on whatever the current state is. They cannot imagine just transforming it differently and having a different outcome. So this contributes to these really common thinking errors. So I thought I had another little thing happening here in my outline, but apparently not. I just went back over all these PowerPoints to make sure they were done correctly. Perfect. Excellent work, Professor. Anyway. So these thinking errors that I'm talking about here, specifically centration and irreversibility, really can contribute to what we call a lack of conservation. In the pre-operational stage, Piaget says that children cannot imagine that qualities such as volume, mass, number, length, that these just immutable qualities are conserved even when the object changes shapes. So we'll come back to that a little bit more. I wanted to finish up some thinking errors. Children tend to display what we call transductive reasoning. So let's say that the child says, well, I was mean to my sister got sick, I made my sister sick. This is what we call transductive reasoning. It's faulty. The sister did not get sick because the child was mean. That doesn't make people sick. But the logic of a 2 to 6-year-old makes them think that they are more powerful than they are, for one thing, that their actions in the world are more impactful than they really are. Anybody who has ever had their parents get divorced when they were between the ages of 2 and 6, when you as an individual were between 2 and 6 and your parents got divorced, you may have blamed yourself. It's your fault because you were bad. You made your parents argue with each other. Things like that. If you have gotten divorced and your children are between those ages, you may have noticed that they kind of blamed themselves. If you didn't see them blaming themselves, they may have done it and you didn't notice. It might be something to talk about, because a lot of times children internalize that somehow bad outcomes are their fault for some reason. I didn't eat my peas, things like that. So it's an example of what we call transductive reasoning. All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break here. I want you to watch the next video in the playlist, which is a child being tested for egocentrism, and you'll see these thinking errors that we've been talking about. So I will see you on the other side of this video.